George R.R. Martin's recent blog posts criticising House of the Dragon Season 2 has got me thinking a lot about the idea of legacy and why George has chosen now to be the time he speaks out in regards to the TV show when he remained silent during the decline of Game of Thrones. Thinking about the concept of legacy made me remember some of my family members who passed away over the last year, and it kind of got me analysing the whole concept of legacy and the idea that we are largely remembered by what we leave behind us. It's the life lessons that get passed on to you by those lost people and the legacy that passes through your family. But legacy can take many forms and can be different things for different people, especially when it comes to art and fiction, which is open to interpretation. For example, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien can represent something completely different from me than it would say for you. Regardless of that deep world and lore he created, those stories he left behind are his legacy, which is why the Tolkien estate has always been so careful with the projects they've greenlit in order to protect that legacy. While adaptations such as Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies, and even Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power are part of Tolkien's legacy, the written works of Tolkien have a legacy separate from all of the multimedia. Even with projects that are beloved by fans and critics, the Tolkien estate has always been very vocal in its criticisms, differentiating it from the written works. When I was a lot younger, I used to think they were just being picky and petty, but as I've gotten older, I've realised the estate are the custodians of Tolkien's world, and it's their job and right to protect it, because the man himself no longer can. We can sit here and debate some of the more questionable sides of the Tolkien estate all day, but what it does do is demonstrate, for the sake of this video, the importance of legacy and protecting it. So how does all this relate back to A Song of Ice and Fire and George R.R. Martin? Well, recently, George has become very outspoken about the issues happening behind the scenes with House of the Dragon and the general direction the story in the show seems to be going in a much more open and candid way than he ever has before. He's never really been this direct in his criticisms of the HBO shows, even during the final season of Game of Thrones. This was all very unexpected. There were accusations he'd acted in an unprofessional manner in doing this, opening up his colleagues on the show to criticism from the wider fan base and media. But like I discussed in my video breaking down the blog post, in a way this statement is kind of true. However, there are many valid reasons why he may have decided to make this post. It's not a black and white situation. But this video is not about the contents of the blog post itself and George R.R. Martin's criticisms of House of the Dragon. If you want to learn more about that, then check out the video linked below. One of the main questions coming off the back of George's blog post is why now? After so many years of keeping away from making comments about the quality of the HBO shows, did he break his silence in such a damning and public way? And I think it all comes back to one answer: legacy. So what will the legacy of George R.R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire be? And why does that relate to his blog post? There is no doubt that George R.R. Martin is among the best and most influential fantasy authors of the 20th century. Of course, I'm never going to compare him to, say, Tolkien, but George, alongside many of his peers, are certainly in that conversation. There is a misconception by a lot of the wider general public that A Song of Ice and Fire, and thus George R.R. Martin, only became popular and successful after HBO's Game of Thrones became a cultural phenomenon. And while yes, the HBO show certainly did raise his profile and the popularity of Westeros greatly in the minds of the wider public, very disingenuous to try and claim George and his books were not widely popular and respected among fans of fantasy fiction before that point. I read the books in around 2009 when I was about 17 years old. I'd always been a huge fan of fantasy fiction and knew of George R.R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire's influence and popularity through word of mouth. From the publication of Game of Thrones in 1996 to just before the publication of A Dance with Dragons in 2011, a month after the airing of Season 1 of HBO's Game of Thrones TV show, some sources have estimated that the books in total had sold around 15 million copies in print alone between 1996 and 2011, which is a huge number. Over that same time frame, George and his books have been nominated and won awards regularly, so it's very clear and doesn't even need arguing that George R. R. Martin and Westeros were extremely popular and successful before the TV shows. There are millions of readers out there prior to the success of the TV shows that dove into the world of Westeros and loved it. Thus, in those terms, to those fans, the books are and will always be George R. R. Martin's legacy. But here's the thing, that might not be the case in terms of the wider public perception of his work outside of the more dedicated fan base. There are two huge issues that make the concept of legacy more complicated that I think A, George himself is very much aware of, and B, does go a long way in explaining why he chose the issues with Season 2 of House of the Dragon as the point for him to speak up publicly. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about The Winds of Winter and the idea of George R. R. Martin finishing the book series, but it's clear from his blog posts that he's well aware of the public enthusiasm for these books, and also how very late he is in finishing them. It's clear that even to the man himself, he believed he would have had at very least The Winds of Winter finished by now. There are lots of reasons as to why the books are still not finished. That will be a subject for another time, but if we are talking about legacy, then we cannot shy away from the fact that if the books are never finished, then it certainly will impact how people view the books in decades to come. In my view, with a sense of sadness that the story was never finished in the way the author envisioned and wanted it to. But I do think the published materials we do have are of such high quality, for many fans of fantasy fiction, the prospect of even an unfinished work might not impact their view on the legacy of A Song of Ice and Fire as you might think. Like I said, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the ifs and buts of The Winds of Winter, but in terms of the wider public's idea of the legacy of George R. R. Martin and Westeros, what I will say is this. The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring, if they never see the light of day, would mean the only ending to the story we will ever have is the HBO shows. Thus, due to this, despite the fact the books are at the core of George's legacy, the show has become just as big a part of it as the books themselves. When HBO first announced it was adapting Game of Thrones as a TV show, of course there was lots of excitement among fans, but I don't think anyone really expected it to become the cultural phenomenon it did. Over the course of the first 3 seasons, as positive reviews and fan excitement spread, Game of Thrones managed to transcend its popularity with genre fans and break into the mainstream television culture. It became one of the must-watch shows of the decade. Yes, there have been other popular shows during this time frame. The Walking Dead jumps to mind, for instance. But Game of Thrones was something different. The only other shows I can think of that I've watched live that at the time of airing had the same kind of cultural impact was maybe the first 3 seasons of Lost and the first season of Heroes. Game of Thrones changed the game. It changed the way television shows were made. It raised expectations from audiences in terms of quality and catapulted the fantasy genre back into the mainstream relevance, with the effects of it still being felt today. And that's not even touching upon the fact that HBO and George R. R. Martin himself earned hundreds of millions of dollars, not just through book sales, but merchandising and selling worldwide broadcasting rights. I think with how many high-budget, huge-scale shows that are nowadays, it's easy to forget that it all came from the success of Game of Thrones. Yes, through the show, many new fans also found the books, but I do think it's very easy to forget, thanks to being so deeply invested in the fan community, that a vast majority of people who watch the HBO shows have never picked up the book, and frankly have no interest in doing so. Thus, their relationship with the world of A Song of Ice and Fire and George R. R. Martin comes only from the TV show, and thanks to the sheer viewership of the show and its cultural impact, I suspect these fans make up significantly more fans than the books themselves. It's just sheer economy of scale. Therefore, we must consider the idea that for these people, the legacy of A Song of Ice and Fire and George R. R. Martin is in fact the TV shows and not necessarily just the books, which, as you might be starting to see, has kind of started to become an issue. Because of the success of House of the Dragon Season 1, it's very easy to forget just how much damage Game of Thrones Season 8 did to the wider brand of the HBO shows, and thus A Song of Ice and Fire in general. In the years between the ending of the show and the start of House of the Dragon, I've never seen a TV show fall out of the cultural zeitgeist so quickly. The sheer speed at which it was forgotten and people moved on when you consider just how impactful the show was is still shocking to this day. It took a very strong season 1 from House of the Dragon to breathe fresh life back into the franchise and recapture some of that lost enthusiasm in the years since Game of Thrones season 8. Even myself, who was always a big fan of Fire and Blood, never foresaw House of the Dragon doing as well as it did during that first season. In essence, it gave HBO a second chance to right the ship and secure the future of the TV universe. For a long time, it was looking like the disappointing ending to Game of Thrones would overshadow the fantastic first few seasons of the show, and in a way, also affect the public perception of George in the books. With the power of hindsight, we can look back and see that the issues with the 8th season of Game of Thrones really was accumulation of the declining quality of the writing of the show post season 4, so the rot really did set in long before. While House of the Dragon season 1 was far from perfect, it was still miles better than what had come directly before. No, it's not reached the same levels of popularity, especially mainstream popularity Game of Thrones did. But the truth is, what happened with Game of Thrones is a 1 in a million event that only happens every decade or so. House of the Dragon, while successful and popular, was never going to reach the same heights, but its success has likewise proven there is an audience for these Game of Thrones spin-offs, with there being a possibility of a decade worth of prequel content that could be adapted to screen, again, widening and impacting the legacy of A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole. So all of this, the books, the shows, the success and the failures, are all part of the wider legacy of George R. R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire. Just different people will focus on different elements that matter most to them. So given the popularity of the shows, for most of the audience, that large percentage who have never and will never pick up the books, the show alone has so much more impact on their views of the legacy than say it will for book fans. So why does all this impact why George R. R. Martin has decided to speak out when he's had plenty of opportunities before, especially with the declining quality of Game of Thrones? Now, if you go back and read a few of George's blogs over the years, and the few times he has spoken in the press about the issues writing The Winds of Winter, it's very clear when the show began, George was confident he could have the books done in by the time the show finished adapting the published material. As we know, around season 5, the show started to go extremely off book, and because they combined 2 books into one season, passed the published books a lot faster than anyone, including George, was really expecting. Therefore, for the last 3 seasons of the show, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss only had George R. R. Martin's vague outlines for the rest of the story to work from. Regardless as to if Benioff and Weiss dropped the ball past season 5, we can say one thing for sure. It's likely we would not have seen such sharp drop in quality in terms of the writing if George had indeed managed to publish The Winds of Winter when he intended to, on time. Therefore, given some of his past comments, it seems possible he didn't speak out about the downturn in quality and ultimately the ending of Game of Thrones, perhaps as he felt at least partially responsible, given there was currently no Winds of Winter or Dream of Spring. If the books were published, there's a strong chance the show wouldn't have gone off the rails to the sheer extent it did, and perhaps the ending may have landed better with viewers. I'm not sure how much stock I do put in this idea, given the working relationship had already broken down between Benioff and Weiss and George before season 6, and ultimately, even without the books, while a challenge, a competent writer still should have been able to pull the pieces of the story together in a more compelling way than Benioff and Weiss managed to. But I could see a circumstance where George hasn't and wasn't vocal about his displeasure with Game of Thrones due to his own contribution to the circumstances that allowed it. And that's where we get to House of the Dragon Season 2, and George's now infamously deleted blog post. The key difference with House of the Dragon is, unlike Game of Thrones, while the source material is a fictional history book, the narrative and the story is finished. We know how the story ends and the key events that need to happen. Thus, House of the Dragon gets a lot less leeway than Game of Thrones did when it comes to changing key story elements that fundamentally change the narrative. We're talking cut characters and some creative choices and changes the writers have made to the source material via their own creative interpretation of it. The idea goes that with the story of the Dance of the Dragons being complete, it unburdens George's conscience somewhat in regards to being critical and vocal about his displeasure. He handed them the finished roadmap, and he did his role as the author of the works in doing so. There are many reasons as to why George R. R. Martin made made that blog post, but in essence, it was his last-ditch attempt to be heard and to try and prevent House of the Dragon making what George believes are the same mistakes Game of Thrones once did. But given his recent 29th of September blog post, it really does appear that whatever has happened behind the scenes with House of the Dragon has left George R.R. Martin feeling very personally aggrieved, which again contributed to his reasonings behind the now deleted Toxic Butterflies blog post. In all, I think what George R.R. Martin has realised, if you piece the puzzle together, is that the TV shows in regards to his wider reputation and legacy are just as much a vital part of that legacy as the written works themselves. It very much was him protecting his legacy and the legacy of the written works in turn. Poor HBO adaptations will reflect badly on the written works to the wider public and audience. I, for one, have always maintained that the show and the book are two very different things. That no matter what happens with the show, the book will always be there for fans to escape to. And while yes, that is true, it is also true that very much like the Tolkien estate has done so well with Tolkien's works, George R. R. Martin too might now have realised the importance of legacy and the impact multimedia has on the perception of the source material. But the main takeaway is for a huge number of fans who don't care for the books, then the TV show will be George's and A Song of Ice and Fire's legacy to them. So of course, George R. R. Martin would want to do whatever he could to try and protect that legacy, be it the books or the shows.